All right, last week we kicked off a 2-part series. Here's the second part. It's been on war, violence, and the morals surrounding all of it. We're looking at these things from various perspectives, including World War II and the war in Israel. For context, real quick, by the way, we recorded these conversations last month, December 2024. So on last episode, Lynn, Roy, Jack, and myself kicked it off with our own thoughts and perspectives on war, wrapping things up with our guests, Marc Turnage and Shane Claiborne, both of them sharing their own differences, especially in regards to the war in Israel this past year. In this episode, you'll hear me and Lynn's reaction to that conversation, and then you'll hear our time with the author of Wounded Tiger. It's a true story novel about one of the Japanese pilots with major involvement in the Pearl Harbor attacks. Thank you guys for listening. Hey, welcome to the Seacoast podcast. Lynn, you've been a part of tons of conversations on this podcast. You've heard all the episodes. That was definitely the heatedest it's ever got.
It was the most heated. It was the most heated it's ever got.
And I
wouldn't say that it's ever been heated.
Right. And I was this close. I was so close to saying something like, "All right, guys, like it's cool," but I just was like, "All right, I gotta keep let it keep going out. Yeah. Let them keep going." But yeah, it got pretty heated because what you have is you have Shane Claiborne, who has taken a lot of flack from Christians in America with his harsh critique of Israel and what they've been doing the last year. And then you have Marc, who sees the situation differently. They both see war as horrible. They both see those initial attacks from Hamas as horrible and not called for, but man, once you get below that, it's just such a complicated conversation. Yeah, you have tons of thoughts. You want to get a couple of them out, or
yeah, I think even in that conversation, I think a thing that stood out to me, it's hard to have a conversation like that when your view on violence is different.
Yes.
And so even, and you know, the listeners are going to hear it, or maybe they've heard a podcast that you've done an episode before with, I think, Jack the Greater and Shane on violence. Right. And that I think violence is a nuanced conversation as well. And so when you're not on the same page about whether, violence is ever okay, or whether, you know, how God sees violence, it's hard to even dig into that conversation about the war in Israel, Gaza. So
yeah, because I heard one of them say something to the effect that there is no love behind the actions of one of these groups.
Right.
And I thought, unless you're motivated to protect your child. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? I mean, in wartime, when who you see as the bad guys are coming around killing women and children, and you decide I'm going to kill them before they kill that's violence that's motivated by love. It's ugly. I think war is a horrible part of the fallen world, and I don't think we'll ever, until Jesus takes over, we're just never going to see a world without war. I don't know if it's even a possibility. So I feel like pacifism is maybe where my heart is at, but I also realize that's just it seems like some wars are just because it's in protection of other people.
Yeah. And that conversation, that previous podcast episode really kind of challenged some things that I would say that my perspective has been that there are instances where war is just or violence is just, and that kind of that episode, listening to it, challenged that. But now I find myself the more conflicted as I'm reading scripture. Because even when you think about, the words of Jesus, well, revelation are also his words. Mm-hmm. And when he starts to pour out his judgment on his final judgment, it appears, whether you're taking a symbolic or literal approach, that he uses nations, authorities, powers to execute that judgment in the same way that he used Babylon and Syria or, Assyria to execute judgment when his people turned from him in the Old Testament. You read those prophets and those words are mirrored in Revelation for final judgment. And so it's hard to say God doesn't want any, or want is a word we can debate, but it's hard to say that God won't use war when it appears that the words, Jesus's words, the revelation that he gives John, shows him pouring out his judgment through violence. So, I mean, it's hard to reconcile to say, who are we to say that we're not seeing that?
Yeah.
Who are we to say that we're not in the middle of that? And I know that there are smarter people than me who've studied the word longer. But whatever approach you're taking to Revelation, you have to ask, some people are like, are we seeing that we're in the middle of this now? Is this to come? Either way, it appears that judgment will come through other nations.
Yeah. 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 And I heard it, and I'll say it the same way, regardless of what you think about Revelation. And let's just say you see it as Jesus coming and kicking and taking names. I've heard a pastor talk about the distinction in the first coming, which we read about in the Gospels, and how that's what we're trying to mirror. So, there's people that are just like, oh, you believe in this hippie, love everybody, Jesus, turn the other cheek, and you better read Revelation. Well, I would say to that person, yeah, but we're being, and I'm not talking, Lynn agrees with this too. But this pastor was talking about how we're modeling our current lives after the first coming. So what we read in the gospel, that's how we carry ourselves. We don't need to worry about the second coming and what Jesus will eventually usher in. Jesus says, follow me. We look at Jesus' life, loving enemies, turning the other cheek, putting an ear back on. So if there was ever any situation in my life where, let's just say I'm talking to you and somebody crossed me and I said, Lynn, it is war. Like this, Joey is, I'm going all out. I'm going to get this person back. I don't think that there is any situation where that posture would be good. Like struggling with forgiveness, sure. But me saying I'm going to get them back, revenge time, war, I just don't think that I ever have that place as a Christian. Countries, it's different. Have you ever heard of a born-again country? A country got saved, and now it's more like Jesus. So I don't necessarily, when I look at countries, I'm not looking at them as, they need to be more biblical. They're governments. Some are led by other faiths.
Yeah, I think I agree in some ways. I think that the desire would be that the leaders are led by faith, and then that would dictate how they lead.
Right.
And I think that's how we've seen throughout Scripture. We see when nations are led by people who fear the Lord, they act very differently than the ones who are led by people who don't. But the question of like what happens, that it also it gets nuanced because every leader and authority has been sifted through the Lord's hands, right? Like he puts people in place, and sometimes he puts allows evil people to be in power in certain nations. And so that's a really hard thing to wrestle with, to understand that like his word says that like the kings and authorities are, like water in his hands. He decides who's going to be an authority. And sometimes that is to give us over to ourselves, And so I think, I would love to see, and I think even as Christians, our job is to war in the spiritual and to desire to see our leaders know the Lord, because if they know and fear him, then absolutely all the decisions they make for the nation are going to be filtered through a fear of the Lord.
Yeah.
But the reality of that is the reality of sin in our world.
Mm-hmm. You want to unpack the rest for another episode?
Absolutely.
Can you contain yourself?
I might be able to contain myself.
And I'll let everybody know that this is just the sweet side of podcasting. Like Lynn and I said, it got kind of heated, and right after the conversation, so Shane had to exit during Marc's closing words, and he texted me and said, please make sure Marc knows that I did not leave because I was angry. I literally had to jump on to another interview. So even after this conversation, these guys love their fellow man and just have some very, very different views on this war. So thank you guys for listening, and we'll catch you next week. So tell our listeners about your background. You obviously wrote this book that we're going to be talking about, but you're a producer, do you write movies? Like, to give us your background.
All right. I was born in Long Island, New York. My dad was an airline pilot. Before that, he was a fighter pilot in the Korean War. I became a Christian when I was about 13. I went to a camp, and they preached the gospel, and I was like, yeah, I definitely want to do that, and I've never really looked back. The scripture says that the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. He gives to everybody a set of gifts that prepares you for your calling, or as I like to say, birds fly, fish swim, and squirrels climb trees, because that's what they're designed to do. So I've always loved true stories, and I've always gravitated toward them, but I didn't know why. But now I see why. It's part of God's purpose and plan for my life, just as he prepares you guys for your own lives. So when I was in fifth grade, I had a teacher who said you have to read, 1 or 2 books a month in her class. Her name was Miss Rose. It was on the second floor of this old building, and I thought, oh man, I do not want to read books. All the girls were like, yeah, this is great. And all the guys were like, no, we don't want to do this. So I went down to the library, and I'm just kind of sulking. I don't want to read, about Charles Dickens and Oliver. And then I see a row of biographies, Abraham Lincoln, Lou Gehrig, Eastman Kodak, Thomas Edison. And I thought, oh, yeah. So I read every book on that shelf. I just gobbled it up. So I've always
How old
loved
were you
true
around
stories.
that time?
I was 11.
Wow.
So I was in fifth grade. So fast forward, I stumbled across this story of John Newton, which I mentioned to you, and I spent years researching that. And then I came across a book. It was from a defunct publisher, an out-of-print book on the guy who led the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, I love history. I love conversion stories. I love redemption stories. I love true stories, even if they're not Christian. I just like true stories. And so I thought, well, I know a pretty good bit about World War II. I've heard a lot of amazing conversion stories. I never heard anything about this guy, Fuchida. So I had very low expectations when I read this book. But since I had already, worked on the John Newton story, I've read many books on screenwriting, story structure, classical story structure, going back to the Greeks and the Romans, what it actually means to tell a story, which, to be honest, is a lost art. Disney has lost billions of dollars because they simply don't know how to tell a story as good as a barber from like 50 years ago. Yeah. They knew how to tell stories. Yeah. Disney does not know how to tell stories. So I'm reading this book.
Take that.
It was one of those moments. It was one of those moments where everything's just in slow motion and just super high resolution. Right? I'm sitting in a barn. My daughter was riding a horse. The smell of horses and hay and sparrows chirping and the dust in the air and the light coming through. I'm reading this book, and I said, Lord, this is a full-blown movie about this guy Fuchida. Do you want me to do this as a film? Is that what you're saying to me? Because I just had this overwhelming sense of this story has got to be told. And before I could even finish the sentence, I just sensed this overwhelming, Martin, get it done. I thought, oh man, it's going to be difficult. I don't know anything about Japanese history, culture, nothing. So I spent 3 years in research and went to, I read thousands of pages of material, got the story together, wrote the screenplay out, got in front of investors. This is a very long story, very compressed. And they loved it. Non-Christian film producer, we loved it. We want to do this movie. And I'm thinking, wow, that wasn't hard. Problem was there's this little tiny asterisk that if you sell the rights, you're the caboose on the train. They can do whatever they want. They can put Bozo the Clown in it. Jesus can turn into higher power. And I thought, no, I can't do that deal. I have to be able to be in a position where I can protect the integrity of the story, which is called creative control. And, if you want creative control, you have to bring money to the table. So I eventually took the screenplay, and I actually met a lady. Since this is a longer format, it's kind of interesting. I'm at a friend's house, a get-together. It's his birthday. This lady has a black T-shirt on and white letters, big bold letters. It says, "Movies ruining the book since 1912."
Amen.
And so I thought, wow, that's interesting. So we sat down and we talked about movies and books and books and movies. And the fact is, there's things you can do in a movie you can't do in a book. There's things you can do in a book you can't do in a movie, like interior thought. You can't have word balloons in a movie. So I thought, well, the way I see it is the story of Wounded Tiger, the guy who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, who came to faith, and all the crazy things happened in his life. That's the mother. And then the movie is a child and the book is a child. That's the way I see it. So from that point forward, I thought, I should just go ahead and make this into a book. So I took the screenplay and novelized it to book form, which is the exact opposite of how it's usually done, which is you have a book and then it's a movie based on the book. In my case, I took the screenplay and novelized it. The beauty of this is when you do a film, if either of you know anything about screenwriting, everything has to be visual. That is, if you can't see it on the screen, you can't write it on the page, i.e., a screenplay can't be, John was having a bad day. He was upset about his divorce. Okay, action. What are we seeing?
Right.
It has to show him come in and like punch his fists in the wall, and then he sees his wedding picture of him and his wife. He holds it, and then he just turns it face down. So it's like all these visual cues of what's happening. So since I had to write the screenplay that way, then when I translated it and converted it into a book, it was very visual, it was very action oriented. Plus, I added over 300 photos, maps, images, letters to the book. Plus, the normal format of nonfiction didn't work for me. It's like, this happened, they said this, they did this. You're just kind of watching these things happen. The format of a novel is all live action. The flames burst out, he screamed and grabbed the thing and ran for his life. Like, okay, you're right there. So what I did is I wrote this book in the format of a nonfiction novel. So it's all written in the format of fiction that's live action happening, but it's a true story. So Truman Capote did this with a book called In Cold Blood. It was done by another guy named Mike, I can't remember his name. He wrote the book called Killer Angels about Gettysburg. And it's a true story, but it's written. So that makes the story really, really engaging. And I've had dozens of people say of Wounded Tiger, best book they've ever read in their life. And so that was the whole goal, is to just tell this compelling story, which is the catalyst for the Lord. So that's a short version of how I came across a story and how I did it. I love true stories, and I've got another dozen I'm working on the side, chipping away at. But I got to get this horse out of the starting gate.
That's cool, man. That's cool. You're really good at this too. Wow, that's awesome. So I would love for people to listen to this podcast conversation and be motivated to go get this book, because it seems like such a compelling story. Thank you for the copy that you sent. I can't wait to read it personally. So I'm gonna leave it to you as far as how much of the story you want to tell, but give people a snapshot of this story. I cannot wait to dive into it. It sounds remarkable.
So what I'd like to do is to set up the story and not give away the story. And as a footnote, the book is in hardcover Kindle, and we're releasing the audiobook version December 7th.
Nice.
That's been in the work for months. And the thing about the audiobook is, I talked to a guy a couple of months ago, and he said he's dyslexic and he doesn't read books, he just does audio. But the vision for this story, it entails 3 separate plot lines that eventually come together in the end. The first is the guy named Mitsuo Fuchida. He was handpicked by Admiral Yamamoto to lead the Pearl Harbor attack. And that's about 50% of this book. Plus, there's a lot of exposition and context of what was going on in Japan, what was in their minds. I remember being in grade school asking my teacher, why did the Japanese attack the United States? They trying to take over America? That didn't make any sense. This tiny little country across the Pacific. I don't get this. And nobody had any answers. And the funny thing is, every year we have the Pearl Harbor attack anniversary, and you see this black and white footage. Yeah, Japanese attacked us and we won. We killed them all. Yay. Yay, USA. I'm thinking, okay, what happened? Why? Why did they do this? So that was a huge part of the discovery of the story. And once I bring that out, now I don't want to make Fuchida a sympathetic character in the book or in the film, but I want him to be a empathetic character. They say, you know what? If I grew up in Japan, if I was a Japanese person and I was marginalized by the great colonial powers, I would feel resentment and I would be upset about this the way he was. I'm not sure I would want to kill people about it, but in the Revolutionary War, we were killing people, and I had a copy of the Declaration of Independence on my wall. I read it many times, and I thought, taxation without representation is not good. I'm not willing to kill people about that. I don't think I'm going to be out there shooting people because of taxation. 99% of the world's been taxed without representation throughout all human history. I'm not sure I'm going to kill people over that. I'm not saying I'm against the Revolutionary War, but I'm not saying I'm for it either. Anyway, going back to Fuchita's story, I wanted people to identify and understand. So I think the job I did is okay, because I've had numerous people say, Martin, when I'm reading these battle scenes from the Japanese perspective, I feel really conflicted of who I want to win the battle.
Wow.
Okay, so that's Fuchita. Okay, so he was in modern nomenclature, he was a superstar in Japan after Pearl Harbor. Here's this small nation, blows away the United States in this prize fight, winner take all, sinks all their battleships, just an unbelievable success. So then there's another guy named Jake DeShazer. He was an American. He's about 30% of the story. He joins the U.S. Army Air Corps, which was the precursor to the Air Force. And he kind of, he stumbles into volunteering for the Doolittle raid, which was the first counterattack of the Americans against the Japanese. And this was only a dozen planes, but the whole idea was to make a tactical bombing of Tokyo and Nagoya and other cities, just to scare the Japanese people and leadership and say, you know what, we can bomb Tokyo anytime we want, but we got to deal with Europe right now. But we're going to come and we're going to destroy you guys. And that was the idea, was to demoralize the Japanese, and it was extraordinarily successful. So Jake DeShazer was the bombardier in the nose of a B-25 bomber, bombed a city, and then his plane runs out of fuel, they bail out, and they end up bailing out over occupied China, because the Japanese had invaded China, and he becomes a prisoner of war for 40 months, tortured, beat, deprivation. It's just a nightmare. In fact, I don't have much of torture in the book, but I had a woman tell me, Martin, I love your book, I'll never watch the movie. I said, why? Because I cannot stand torture. I said, well, it's only like a few minutes. She goes, I can't deal with it. I said, all right, fine. But so we're not going to be graphic or in your face, but I mean, they tortured him. All right, so then the third plot line, which is very interesting, is a family called the Covell, Covell. They were highly educated missionaries who went to Japan, and their kids were born and raised in Japan, so they spoke fluent Japanese. They loved the Japanese people. They were pacifists. They would go to the worst part of the industrial poverty in Yokohama and minister to these people, wash them, feed them, and teach them about Jesus Christ. But as the nation ramped up for war, they thought, we got to get out of this place. This is not good. So he takes a job teaching in the Philippines. In the Philippines was Douglas MacArthur. There was thousands of U.S. troops, thousands of Filipino troops, and they believed, hey, the Japanese will never attack the Philippines. It's too heavily guarded. Of course, that didn't turn out that way. The Japanese did attack, and they took over the Philippines. All right, so he's in the Philippines with his wife and their 3 kids. They send their kids back to the United States, and their oldest is a girl named Margaret, nicknamed Peggy. She goes to a university in upstate New York. So that's the setup. Japanese who hates America. Jake DeShazer, who when he found out about the Japanese Pearl Harbor attack, he just wanted revenge and to kill Japanese. Well, he ends up becoming a prisoner of war. So while he's in prison, he's just seething with hatred, and he says in his own words, he was crazy with hatred toward the Japanese. And then he realized, is this the way I want to live? Is this the way I want to die? Just dying in hatred? And he remembered his mom. So this is a shout out to the moms of the world. You think you're not doing anything. I feed him and I change diapers and we send him to school. I guess nothing ever sunk in with my son or daughter, whatever. That's not true. They remember your example. They remember your attitude. They remember your genuine, pure love of God and love of others. And that's what happened to Jake DeShazer. He thought, you know what? I want to be like my mom, but I have no clue. So they passed books around. He finally got a Bible and started reading it. And he was very skeptical. No, how can you know the future? Does God talk to people? I don't think so. But he finally thought, what have I got to lose here? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and give this a shot. Okay, God, I'm going to do exactly what you say and just see what happens. And unbelievable supernatural things start popping. And you're like, wow. And he says, I'm in. I'm going to do this the rest of my life. So that's his story. But eventually his story feeds into Jake DeShaze's story and the Covell story. What happens is, without giving away too much, Fuchida, his star was at its peak, after Pearl Harbor, but it was only months. It was like months later in the Battle of Midway, where the Japanese lost a bunch of the aircraft carriers. And that was a turning point for the Japanese. They knew, we don't have the manufacturing capacity to compete with the United States. We can't beat them in a fight. They're hoping to negotiate, but that never worked out. So Fuchida's star is falling, and then this girl, Peggy, her parents had to flee into the mountains, again, without giving away too much, and they were being mistreated and being tracked down by the Japanese. So Peggy thought, well, what's the best, most loving thing I can do for the Japanese? And since she spoke Japanese, she volunteered to work at an internment camp where American Japanese were moved from the West Coast. It was called I can't remember the name of this act, but they had what was called a zone across the West Coast, because they didn't want Japanese sympathetic to Japan, destroying, utilities and spying. When the Pearl Harbor attack took place, the Japanese knew the location of every ship in the harbor. Yeah. Why? Because there was Japanese Americans sending information to Japan. It was called the exclusionary zone. That's what I'm looking for. So they made the West Coast exclusionary, and they moved all Japanese Americans into internment camps. It was a great injustice in many ways, but it's kind of hard to think, well, what else can you do? You can't ask a person, are you loyal to the United States or not? They didn't know what to do. Anyway, she volunteered to help these people. And then later there was a hospital in Utah that said, we have prisoners of war from Germany and from Japan, and she had a Red Cross certificate, so she volunteered to go to this hospital. And that's where she met Fuchida's engineer, the guy who worked on his plane. So I can't give away too much of this story, but I've had people say it was the most powerful love story they've ever read in their life. So when people say, Martin, is this a love story? I say, well, it's not romantic love, but it's kind of like a couple of clicks above that, by doing good to those who are not doing good to you. Mm. Those who hate you, love your enemies. So that's an overview of the story. You can ask me whatever questions you might have.
Wow.
Man.
How did this, even as the time that it took you to research this and to go through this, how did it personally impact your life? Like, what is the fruit that you've seen just in learning about these people and writing the screenplay and then writing the book?
Well, it's affected me in a lot of ways. One thing is this girl, Peggy Covell, she is an unassuming girl. She was an unassuming girl. She was a librarian, right? Librarian. Her life impacted the guy who led the attack on Pearl Harbor and led to his salvation. So it's like, how does this happen? And the answer is, simple acts done in love and kindness can have monumental impacts on the lives of other people and on the world itself. We don't have to aspire to do great things. Well, I'm never going to be Elon Musk. God only makes one of those guys every 50 years or 100 years or whatever. You're not going to be Elon Musk, but that's fine. God made you to be you. Somebody's in the grocery store. They spill their groceries. That's a bummer. Well, I go over and I help the lady put their groceries back into her basket because it's the right thing to do. Now, you don't know who this lady is. I heard a guy who told me some lady had a flat tire, so he helped her fix her tire. And then the lady said, do you know who I am? He says, no. It was Madonna.
What?
Madonna, the musician. So here's the thing. We're told to preach the gospel. That's true. But when you look at Jesus Christ, he wasn't always just, here's the message, here's the message, here's the message. People came to him and says, my son is sick. Help me. He said, well, here's the gospel. It's like, I will help you. I heard a guy who's an evangelist in Japan, and the next door neighbor's lawn was like a foot high. So he just cut their grass for him. And what it turned out is this lady was old, she was kind of sick, and she despised Christians. I mean, she hated them with a passion. But she started to like these people because they They cut her grass for her for free. She eventually came to Christ, all right? So the takeaway for me, Lynn, is that simple acts done in kindness can have monumental impacts. So every day I say, Lord, what would you like me to do? How can I help other people? It's not complicated. Maybe you'll impact, a world leader. Maybe you'll just impact your next door neighbor. That's not your job, though. Your job is just follow the Lord, and you'll see things happen. Yeah. So it's made my life simple. I'm not trying to get the gospel wedged into every conversation. I just ask myself, how can I help this guy? So I have a friend whose computer breaks down every now and then. He calls me up. He's kind of struggling with how to enter the kingdom of God, but I've developed a friendship with him. He called me yesterday. Hey, Martin, I can't figure out this thing on my computer. What do I do? And I help him. And so I've developed a friendship with him. And I think the gospel comes down to friendship.
That's good.
So I do. You get to decide whether or not you answer some of these questions because you wrote the book, but not everyone agrees on the morality of killing in battle. So for some people, it's a Christian belief. Hey, if I was drafted, I would do any and everything I could not to fire a weapon because it's against my beliefs. There's a lot of people that don't believe that way. How do you pronounce the guy's last name? The guy who led the attacks on Pearl Harbor?
Fuchida.
Yeah. Did he get to a place where he repented of being a part of any sort of war in general, like flipping the morality of being a soldier?
No, he did not. However, Jimmy Covell was a pacifist. He was very, very much of a pacifist. He was against fighting on all levels. And I think that's perfect for his character in this story. However, once the Japanese overran the Philippines and they were killing and torturing people, he says, where's MacArthur? We want the bad guys out of here. So it's kind of, a bit contradictory. But there's the thing called the just war. I mean, David killed Goliath, and the Lord gave him the power to do that. So I don't see life as being a right. People say right to life. I don't see it that way. I see life as a gift, and it's a responsibility. I actually worked in a federal prison for 7 years, and the fact is, if you violate your responsibilities as a human being, you can lose your privilege to be alive. That's the death penalty. So it's the same thing takes place in war when nations are aggressive toward passive neighbors. They have a right to defend themselves. So I'll tell you what's interesting in this story, people still debate the morality of the atomic bomb, a weapon of mass destruction that kills innocent civilians. So I have thought about this. I've read about this at great length. And what's really interesting is Fuchida had a lot of supernatural things happen in his life before he became a believer. He didn't know what was going on. Mm-hmm. His plane could have easily been lost in the Pearl Harbor attack. A shrapnel anti-aircraft fire severed or almost severed one of his control cables. It was one of those frayed cables, right? Just hanging by a thread. And if that had popped, I wouldn't be talking to you right now. His plane would have just spiraled into the ocean. Nobody would have ever heard of this guy ever again. But it didn't. And his engineer, the guy who later was at this hospital, told him, that saved your life. The gods are with you, small g gods, because in Japan they believe in kami, all these gods everywhere. So with Fuchida, he was also in Hiroshima, and this is getting into the use of the atomic bomb. He was in Hiroshima because the military in Japan was ramping up for a huge defensive preparation for the ultimate invasion of Japan, which the United States was getting ready to do because the Japanese just wouldn't surrender. So he's in Hiroshima in this big meeting. He gets a phone call. Hey, they need you at this other base. He leaves. The next day, the atomic bomb is dropped. His hotel is vaporized. Everybody in his hotel killed. 90,000 people died. He comes back the next day, spends 3 days walking around in radioactive rubble. A month later, almost everybody on a search party is dying of radiation sickness. Hair falling out, gums bleeding, red patches on their skin, and they just die. He didn't have any effects, nothing. And so when he was in Hiroshima, the day after, a subordinate officer asked him, how could the Americans use a weapon like this on us? And I thought, okay. And when I was reading it the first time, I'm thinking, well, that's a good question. Here's Fuchida. He's in Hiroshima seeing, dead bodies as far as the eye can see. He said, I would be proud to drop that on the United States. This is war.
Wow.
This is war. We're trying to beat the other guys. So he didn't have any problem with the atomic bomb because you're trying to defeat your enemy. He thought it was a powerful weapon. So he wasn't resentful to the United States for using the bomb. But I'm not. So I haven't debated the morality of weapons of mass destruction. However, I did put in the book information that I hope helps people understand that the United States did not feel that they were at war with the people of Japan, but with the leaders of Japan. So they dropped leaflets, millions and millions of leaflets in Japanese that wrote the names of cities and saying, hey, we're for the people of Japan. You have bad leaders, but we have to prevent you from being able to wage war. So we're destroying factories that produce weapons of war. So if you're in these cities, evacuate them because we're going to destroy it. Go away, take your kids, take your family. And that's what the British did in World War II. They sent all their kids out into the countryside. They evacuated the cities as much as possible. But it was illegal to have these leaflets in your hand. If you're found in possession of one of these leaflets, it could be the death penalty.
Wow.
The United States had radio broadcasts telling people to flee these cities. So when people were in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, they knew full well this city was going to be bombed like every other city, or could be. It was a military center. If they stayed there against advice, well, I mean, what can the United States do? We're going to destroy all their manufacturing facilities. Another thing that's it's not ironic, it's poetic justice. That's the term I'm trying to think, because I'm a writer. Poetic justice. This is poetic justice. Nagasaki had a manufacturing plant that manufactured torpedoes. The torpedoes that were used in Pearl Harbor were manufactured in Nagasaki, and the second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, and that ended the war. Mm-hmm. So the torpedoes of Nagasaki began the war with the United States, and the atomic bomb in Nagasaki ended it.
Wow,
it's kind of interesting. So here's my big platform for argument when people say you should not use an atomic weapon because it kills innocent civilians. The question is, you can't say it kills innocent civilians until you can define what an innocent civilian is. Is a person who manufactures torpedoes an innocent civilian? Is a person who's making bullets an innocent civilian? At what point did they become innocent? At what point did they become guilty? In Germany, they said, we were just following orders. It's not our problem. And they said, well, no, it is. You're participating in a war effort, a war of aggression toward innocent neighboring countries. That is guilt. So only God can say whether you're guilty or innocent. But if you were in Japan and they said, we want you to build torpedoes to sink American ships to kill Americans, would you do it? Would you say, you know what, I think I'm going to take a rain check on that one. Well, we're going to throw you in jail. You may never come out. You're probably going to die there. Well, that's the choice we have to make. So before we can talk about innocent civilians, we have to define what a guilty civilian is. And only God can know the conscience of a person. But
yeah,
of course, there's no fun way to die, and there's no good weapon that kills people. This is a great thing. But war is necessary in this world, in this fallen world. And it's still something that I hope we don't ever have to use nuclear weapons again, though.
Well, I mean, that's what I love being, that's why I relish being in God's kingdom, is because we get to care about the deeper things of forgiveness, which is what this book is about. It's like, that's the most important stuff. And, I'm curious when it comes to civilians, for instance, post-World War II, historically in the last 60 or so years, how are Japanese students taught about World War II? Like, do you have knowledge on that? Like, how?
Oh, yeah, I do.
How is it explained to them, the atomic bombs? In school?
That's a really great question. Okay, so in Western culture, we have what's regarded as a guilt-based moral system. That is, we don't do it because we feel bad. We're violating God's laws. That's wrong to do. The IRS gets people mailing money to the IRS of income taxes they didn't pay, and they do it anonymously. Why? Because they feel guilty about it. in Western culture in general, and Japan in particular, they've had what's referred to as a shame-based culture. Now, neither the U.S. nor Japan are exclusively guilt and shame, but it's much more shame-based. So if you're on a train in Japan and you leave your wallet on the train with the money in it, you can go to the train station and you get your wallet with your money and everything. It's not because they believe in God or the judgment. It's because they believe, they think, well, if I got caught, how would that affect my family? How would that affect my school? How would that affect my job? And they see themselves in the eyes of others. So they're a shame-based culture. So as far as the use of the atomic bomb and how the Japanese see World War II being a shame-based culture, they don't talk about World War II because it's shameful. We lost. It's like, are you talking about your grandfather who lost the prize fight of the century? No, we're not talking about him because he lost, and that's shameful. So I've talked, I know there's a church in town, and they teach English as a second language, ESL, and they help Japanese nationals and others speak fluent English, and then they give Bible studies. So every now and then they'll ask me if I want to come down and do conversational English with some Japanese businessmen, which I love doing because I ask questions. I'm a question guy. So I asked these guys that very question, Joey. I said there were two professionals in their mid to late 30s. I said, because I'd heard this before and I wanted to double check. I said, so tell me, how much do you study about the Pacific War, World War II in school? And this one guy looks down at the table, he kind of smiles, and he looks up at me and he said, 2 pages. 2 pages. They don't talk about it at all, zero. So on the one hand, that's kind of bad. But on the other hand, it actually works to my benefit because now Japanese nationals are like, what happened? Hey, we don't talk about that. Well, there's this movie called Wounded Tiger that talks about the whole thing, or the book. Wounded Tiger has been translated into Japanese. It hasn't been distributed in wide release, but it's available on Amazon because I wanted the Japanese people to know the story. And I had a woman, she was the associate producer of The Last Samurai, starring Tom Cruise and Ken Watanabe. Are you familiar with this film, The Last Samurai?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so she's a pretty high-level producer, not a believer. Her grandfather was an advisor to Emperor Hirohito. She was the head of casting for this film, and she's worked on a bunch of big films. Anyway, she wanted to read the book in English because she was raised in high-level schools because her father was a diplomat. Anyway, she read Wounded Tiger front to back, loved it. In fact, her endorsement is on the back of the book. Her name's Yoko Narahashi. If you look at the back cover of Wounded Tiger. Yeah, so that's her. So what that tells you is she's a Japanese national, but I tried to be fair-minded about describing what happened and why it happened, and not in a way of Japanese bad, America's good. I didn't want that. I don't believe that, but I wanted to tell the story. So the Japanese do not talk about World War II. I remember being in Hiroshima, and it just worked out this way. I didn't plan it that way, but I was there during the anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima in August 6th. So I'm at this museum, and this is for real, the real story. I mean, I'm in there, I'm thinking, I hope nobody asks me about how could Americans drop the atomic bomb on a bunch of innocent civilians. I do not want to debate somebody in this museum. I mean, I'm literally thinking this in my head. I'm not saying anything to anybody. I'm by myself, right? This guy who has a heavy Italian accent, he says, how could they drop this bomb? Dropping the bomb is so terrible. And he says, you American, right? I said, yeah. I said, how can American? He starts yelling at me about how America could drop this bomb like that.
The Italian guy.
No, I'm not doing this. But it's still the way Japanese couches World War II is, atomic bombs are bad, war is bad, no war, no atomic bombs, we're against atomic bombs, the end. And I'm thinking, well, okay, but what led to the atomic bomb is kind of important, guys, so you can't skip that. So I think it works to my benefit that there will be a huge audience for this film. I have a friend who's a historical consultant, speaks Japanese. He worked on the Pacific, worked on Band of Brothers, and he read the book, critiqued it for me. I paid him. He said, Martin, this film is going to do gangbusters in Japan. I said, well, why do you say that? He said, because when Americans do stories of Japanese nationals, they're two-dimensional cardboard cutouts. They're not real people because they don't really know what they're talking about. You know what you're talking about. These are flesh and blood people, and they are going to love the story. So when we printed the book in Japanese, we gave it to some people. One guy, 77 years old, was in Japan during the war. He said he read the book 3 times, front to back, 3 times. It's a 600-page book. Another guy read it in a single sitting, 600 pages, read the whole book. And he said, unbelievable story. He said, I'm telling all my friends, you've got to read this book, etc. So the whole point of all this is, in Japan, only 0.5% or fewer are professing believers. In South Korea, it's like 30 to 40%, a lot in South Korea. But the gospel has never really taken root in Japan. And I'm hoping that if they see a Japanese national and can follow his journey from being an ultra-nationalist and saying, I want our country to be great, and then understanding, hey, this is not how it works. There's a better way to live. Instead of seeking your own glory, you seek the glory of God, and you love your neighbor as you love yourself. That's what Fuchida did. He spent his life loving other people and telling a story of how he came to faith. So I'm hoping it will open doors as a catalyst. Mm-hmm. Every person in Japan's got a mobile phone, and you can read the Bible on that phone in Japanese in 1 minute, but they don't have any reason to do that. So I'm hoping that Wounded Tiger will be a catalyst of curiosity, because without giving away too much of the story here, Fuchida came across a Bible through a weird set of circumstances, and he knew nothing about the Bible. I mean, nothing about the Bible. Can you imagine reading the Gospels, not knowing what's going to happen? Well, that was him. And the Lord spoke to him, and he gave his life to God. So I want people who read the book or watch the film say, well, I'm not killing people. I don't hate people, but things in my life are not going the way I want. Fuchida read the Bible, and God helped him. Jake DeShazer also read the Bible. God helped him. Well, then that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read the Bible. Maybe God will help me. And the scripture says that the Lord is a rewarder of those who earnestly seek him. And Jesus said, knock, and the door will be open. Ask, you receive. Seek, you'll find. Everyone who seeks finds. So that is the promise of God. And I want to encourage people, God has something good for you. Give him the opportunity and hear what he has to say.
That's so good.
Big congratulations. Ooh. Oh, go ahead. Did you have a question?
No, I'm just blown away.
Yeah, I don't want to add to anything that you just said, because there's so much here. If listeners aren't interested in getting this book by now, they just don't like history, or their hearts are dead.
Yeah. Well,
I cannot wait to read Amazon, this book, honestly.
You can read the first chapters free. You can read the first chapters free on Amazon. The audiobook will release December 7th. And what we did is we used 3 voices. We have a Japanese national who does all the part of Japan and Fuchida. Good. And then we have a woman who does all the Covell stories, sounds like Peggy's voice. And then we have a guy who sounds like, a guy in his late 20s who does Jake DeShazer. So as you skip from one plot line to the next, it's a different voice. Now, I'm not an audiobook guy because I'm just too scattered. My mind just wanders. I'm a very creative person. But I have listened to audiobooks. But what I did is that we sent the samples to people who listen to hundreds of audiobooks. There's one guy told me, he said, Martin, I've listened to almost 400 audiobooks. So I gave him the samples. He says, Martin, that's exactly what we want to hear. This is going to work. A guy told me yesterday, I sent him the samples. So I think we sent you a book and had a bunch of enclosures with it. Did you get that with the book?
Yeah.
Or did you buy the book on your own? Yeah, well, there's a QR code where you can scan and listen to what the audiobook sounds like. It's just like a 3-4 minute sample. I think you'll really like it. So this is a character-driven story. It's not about bombs, planes, and ships. It's about a transformation of the pilot who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, the guy who attacked the Japanese in DeShazer's story, and then the Covell story of how to live a simple Christian life, even if everything goes as wrong as can possibly be imagined, or worse. Something really, really good happens. And you're thinking, how does this happen? So that's the story of Wounded Tiger. I want it to understand it's a positive ending, and it's very unpredictable. I like that in stories. If I'm watching a movie or reading a book, well, the protagonist is going to do A or B, maybe he'll do C. Once they start doing A, B, or C, I kind of check out. It's predictable. But if the guy does D, I'm thinking, whoa, I was not thinking of D. All right, where are you going? That's what happens in Wounded Tiger. Over and over, things happen like, you're kidding me. What? I thought they were dead. What? He's come. How did these things all connect? So when I research this story, it's kind of like digging through dirt. You dig through lots and lots of dirt, And then you hit this gold nugget or this gold coin, like, golly, this is unbelievable. I'm putting it in the book. I'm putting it in the film. So that's what people can look forward to. And as I mentioned, it's got, hundreds of 5-star reviews. Wounded Tiger currently has a higher 5-star rating than John Grisham's best-selling book, The Firm. I'm not saying it's a better book. I'm the author. I can't say that. But I have had dozens say best book they ever read in their life. Like dozens of people have said that. So I don't think anyone will be disappointed in going through this book. But it is a fat book. It's 600 pages. So especially guys that go, oh, Martin. I do not read fat books. Don't get me hooked on a fat book. I'm not going to read a fat book. Right. So I said, listen, you don't have to read the book. Just read 10 pages. You'll get a feel for it. Awesome. And then inevitably I'll get the email or the text message, Martin, I was at page 140 when I realized I was only going to read 10 pages. This is an unbelievable story. So my goal is to encourage people. God is on your side. He has something good for everybody, and he's got something good for you.
Awesome.
It's good.
Hey, thank you so much.
Yeah.
This really was a pleasure, and I'm not just saying it. I'm going to read this book. I'm a big-time reader,
yes.
and I read Charles Barkley's biography, and it was a good 500 pages, so the pages don't intimidate me. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Yep. I appreciate it. God bless you guys, and keep doing the good work.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin.
You've been watching Seacoast Church's Things You Won't Hear on Sunday podcast. You can now become a patron of this podcast and receive exclusive content. Your support goes towards Seacoast ministry efforts in local prisons. Also, be sure to leave us a review and subscribe to this podcast so that you get these episodes as soon as they're released. All of this information can be found in the show notes. Thanks for watching.